GA Circular works with industry, investors, governments and multilateral agencies providing research and data analytics, technical assistance and strategic advice to help drive the circular economy in Asia. Please welcome the Chief Business Officer from GA Circular, Sumangali Krishnan.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to be speaking in front of you and to be speaking at this podium. So exciting. My name is Sumangali Krishnan, and I'm here representing GA Circular. Many of you have known GA Circular and its past avatar as Gone Adventuring. And we rebranded earlier this year with the realization that given all of the efforts and knowledge of all of the people in this room, as well as many, many people on the ground in various parts of Asia, that we're most undeniably on the road to circularity. Slowly but surely, we're on this path, and not saying it's an easy path, and we definitely have our work cut out for us. And I think it's useful to take a look at what we do as we have to scale the curve of circularity. I think even as we brace ourselves for this climb, it's useful to think about what's happened and the road thus far. In a somewhat simplified manner, I've sort of listed 5 areas that we've been working on in the recent years. And the first of which is the building of baselines. Many of you have been seeing the data coming out over the past few years, studies across the value chains and across the life cycle of various types of plastics. Also in focus has been the attention that's been drawn to marine litter legislation, as well as ways to address marine debris, and also plastics and packaging focused policy. Another area of focus has been technology, both the expanding and developing of existing technologies for plastics recycling, but also innovation in the field of technologies for plastics that are not as recyclable. We couldn't touch all of these 3 topics if we didn't acknowledge and pay attention to the fact that a lot of recycling in the region happens because of the informal sector. So that's been a key area of focus. And finally, behavior change across the value chain and amongst all the participants, starting from the consumer all the way up until the recycler, has been a big area of focus as well. I'm just going to jump briefly into each of these. In terms of building baselines, and what do we mean by that? We've been looking at material flow analyses, looking at specific materials and understanding how they flow through within each of their cycles within the value chain. Value chain studies, which are intended to look at the various participants within the value chain and how they operate and what the bottlenecks are at each of these different links within the value chain. Leakage audits. These have been studies that are used to identify how much is in fact leaking into the environment and what comprises of the materials that are leaking into the environment, and landfill audits. Some of the key insights we get from the collective studies that we have done is the fact that different materials have different value chains. They have to be addressed differently and treated differently. So, recognizing that we need to have a few different tools in our arsenal to attack the issue of plastics leakage. And the second part is that end markets and value chain activities are critical in identifying what the solutions are, and they will drive the collection. It's going a little bit deeper into the material flow analysis. What we've looked at in some of our studies is to identify the degree of market inputs, and then assessing based on collection coverage, we identify how much waste is actually collected, how much is being pulled out by the informal sector as well as the formal sector, and then what ends up at the landfill, so that's a loss, as well as what is actually collected for recycling. And this is an example from the case of PET. Another aspect is the study of the value chain. And we've done some deep dives into each of the different links within the value chain to understand who the different players are. The informal sector, as I mentioned earlier, is critical to this process. Next in line is the junk shops, and these are the small businesses that are operating in each of the different cities to collect and sort into a single stream the different materials that are being collected for recycling, a very critical link within the value chain. Large aggregators take into account the logistics and the transportation of these materials into the recycling solutions, and are also a critical link that suffer quite a bit when it comes to transportation costs or logistics costs. And then as far as the pre-processors and end solutions go, they're also impacted quite intensively by the export market, the volatility of prices. And so each of these different links within the value chain require special attention as we're looking at solutions for recycling plastics. Landfill audits, these are some of the studies that we've done to understand exactly how much of what different material type is going into landfills. And when we do plastics categorizations, we understand better what types of material are being lost to landfill. And retrieval from landfill as well is a big challenge because it's highly contaminated and does not quite enter the recycling process in a way that we would like for it to. And finally, looking at leakage, we've looked at materials that are leaking in a report that we put out a while ago. We're looking at materials that leak into the waterways and exactly what types of materials and also the nature. So in this study, we identified that the variation of materials that are consumed on the go versus materials that are consumed within households is quite a distinction, and we're able to recommend solutions based on the nature of materials leaking into the environment. The baseline studies that we've been talking about would not be sufficient if we didn't also look at plastics policy or marine policy. So an understanding of the existing regulations and the existing policies in place at the global, at the national levels, as well as regional level, as well as local policies that are in place is critical to understand what is needed and where things are missing. Things like source segregation, as Doug mentioned earlier, is a very critical aspect of legislation that's needed within the ASEAN landscape. This is a report that we're hoping to launch tomorrow here at Sea of Solutions with UNEP. And the key policy, the focus of this report is to understand some of the policy regulations that are focused directly on packaging and packaging plastics. Some of the key insights that we have from this report are the fact that marine litter legislation is something that has become a critical focus for countries all across the ASEAN. Plastic bans have been contemplated both globally and are being considered within ASEAN as well, with a special focus on single-use plastics. What are the challenges of some of these bans are also being considered within the report. And finally, we briefly touch on the take-back and the EPR policies. As you know, Indonesia and Malaysia already have a strong framework for these policies, but they're still in development. And so this is a sort of initial foray into the idea of policies and what's required within this space. Another aspect to be covered, like I mentioned earlier, is technology. Looking at technology for both existing recycling processes, as well as new innovations that are coming in for materials that are harder to recycle. In a study completed for Amcor, we looked at all of the different solutions for flexible plastics and the state of the industry for those materials within the ASEAN region. Again, the key insights from some of these and the key learnings is the fact that we have to rely on the existing technology to boost collection. And once we build that, we can rely on innovation in the end markets. And but the continued demand for material is necessary, and if that doesn't happen, then we have, just bales and bales of flexible packaging piling up in warehouses, as we saw on our visits on ground. The other aspect is capacity building, introducing some of the technologies and some of even the processes to the material sorters and recyclers is really critical. And finally, the importance of domestic offtake. Having somebody buying those materials just within the national boundaries is really critical, because relying on an export market, relying on these materials going outside implies that you're exposed to a fair amount of volatility in prices. As I mentioned, the informal sector is another really critical component of this entire process in plastics in Asia. We rely so heavily on them. 97% of our recycling is done by the informal sector. We have a very small amount of formal recycling in the region, in the ASEAN countries. And as far as the knowledge base of the recycling sector, it's quite minimal and poor, and not all of them are quite aware of the recyclability of the material, so there's a big gap. They're also not as well informed about the prices or the logistics, and they sort of operate in very, very small information circles and suffer from a lot of the consequences of being on the fringes of society. So it's really, really important that we work very closely with the informal sector and make sure that they're working at a more optimal and efficient pace. And another insight that we noticed was as countries develop, as we start seeing an increase in standard of living and an increase in lifestyle changes, the informal sector starts to decline, and obviously people are choosing professions that are less, that are more favorable and less sort of stigmatic as far as being part of the informal sector, and so we are risking losing the informal sector if we don't either incorporate them into mainstream and remove the stigma of being the informal sector or the lower end of the society. And finally, behavior change. What we've done in a study that we're working on currently for the World Bank is identifying the 3 different behaviors. So we realize that it's not just a single behavior that needs to change. There's 3 different streams of behavior that need to change. We've demarcated them as littering behavior, because that's something that really causes leakage. Reduced usage, so where can we reduce the amount of usage, whether it's in the case of excessive plastic, so bringing your own bags and the solutions around limiting the amount of plastics that's really being put out in the economy. And finally, sorting and recycling. So these are the 3 behaviors that we would like to address. Some more about it, I just want to talk about the journey ahead. And the journey ahead is really, simplistically speaking, is divided into industry-led efforts and then government-led efforts. When we're talking about industry-led efforts, we're talking about the formation of collective organizations. Doug mentioned this earlier. So there's been a lot of work that companies have been doing on their own, but I think the time is ripe, and as we scale the curve, the time is right for companies to come together. And we've been seeing this kind of collective action in countries. We've been active in conversations in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, building roadmaps and arriving at these conversations in Thailand and Myanmar as well. While all of these collective efforts are in force, we're also looking at, singular company efforts, redesigning packaging, moving from, say, colored PET to clear PET, which is a really big move when you're trying to influence improved recycling processes, and also the impact of behavior change campaigns with a very comprehensive strategy. Alongside, as we mentioned, the government-led efforts, both within each country at the national level as well as the local level, but also what are we looking at in terms of ASEAN-level interventions. Some of the recommendations in our report are looking at sort of having a homogeneous definition of what is recycling, so that we can start comparing, apples to apples, and also look at making sure that, inter-country trade is made more meaningful, especially in the case of scrap plastics. With that, I want to sort of, introduce our report, our most recent report. It's called The Full Circle. It sort of synthesizes everything that I've been talking about today in a singular report. We're taking the example of PET, and using the case of PET bottles, it's trying to understand across the insights from 6 countries. And we're looking at baselines, we're looking at the policy landscape, looking at the technology requirements, as well as the informal sector and the persistent behaviors along the value chain. What you find in the report is a detailed material flow analysis, but also insights such as the fact that only 54% of bottles sold in cities, this was a study done just based on cities, where there is a robust informal sector, are collected for recycling. Obviously, this rate is much lower when you're looking at rural areas. The informal sector, as I mentioned earlier, is responsible for 97% of the PET collected, which is a very, very high reliance when you're looking at recycling. The recommendations that we highlight is the fact that while the push and the drive towards getting people to sort and separate is really good in terms of behavior change, and of course there's policy enforcements that need to be put into place, we have to also recognize the fact that recycling on scrap plastic, as Steve mentioned earlier, it's a commodity market. It's really important to make sure that the market is robust and that the end market is actually pulling these materials with adequate demand. And that demand can only be put into place if there's an adequate incentive or a price incentive at the end to make sure that there's adequate collection happening through the value chain. The key levers we also highlight within the report, the key levers to achieve 100% collection. Of course, that's an ambitious goal, but I think it's possible if we put everything into place and we bring everything in order in terms of the policy efforts as well as the industry-led efforts. And I think it'll be really, really exciting as we start in driving up the collection of these materials. As you can see, all of these slides have the QR code, and the report is also available on our website. And please feel free to reach out to me or any of my team if you have any questions. Well, in my presentation here. Thank you.